I want to be clear about something before I start. I am not the kind of person who writes these things. I've read plenty of HFY posts over the years. Back when I was a kid, before the Accord, before the Coalition Medical Exchange Program even existed, I used to read them on my tablet during long cargo shifts on the Meridian Line. Stories about humans being tougher than anyone expected. Stories about us surprising the galaxy. I'd read them and think, yeah, sure, we're something special, and then I'd go back to loading shipping containers at 3 in the morning and forget about it. I never thought I'd be the person writing one. But here I am. 41 years old, one titanium plate in my left shoulder, a medical file that's been flagged by no fewer than 4 separate species healthcare systems, and a memory I cannot shake no matter how many times I try. So I'm going to write it down. Here's what happened to me inside the Vithran Medical Collective's Orbital Station 7 months ago. Here's what a Virath nurse named Sorrel 6 Ascending did that nobody was supposed to know about. And here's why, when I think about it now, I don't feel angry anymore. I feel something closer to wonder. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Chapter 2 Setup. Let me paint the picture for you, because the picture matters. Orbital Station 7, most humans just call it OS7, because we hate long names. It's just a thing we do, orbits at the L2 point of the Caprian system, about 40 million kilometers from the nearest inhabited planet. It's a coalition installation, meaning it's technically neutral ground, meaning humans are technically welcome there, meaning in practice that we are the smallest and weirdest minority in any room at any given time. I've been stationed there for 11 months as part of the Human Coalition Medical Exchange. The program had started 4 years earlier as this kind of diplomatic gesture. The idea was to embed human medical personnel in coalition healthcare environments and coalition medical personnel in human hospitals. Cross-training, cultural exchange, mutual understanding, all that good stuff. It looked great in the press releases. In reality, what it mostly meant was that I spent 11 months being stared at. I'm a paramedic, was a paramedic, I guess, though I'll always think of myself that way. 22 years in emergency medicine back on Earth, started in New Chicago, moved up through the Federal Medical Corps, ended up with a specialty certification in multi-environment trauma response, which is a fancy way of saying I was good at keeping people alive in weird places. That certification is what got me flagged for the exchange program. That and the fact that I speak passable Virath, which is apparently so rare among humans that the Coalition Recruitment Coordinator, who contacted me, actually asked me to say something in it during the video call just to make sure I wasn't lying. I said, Velem Sorathi Velem Thurin, which means roughly, I come in care, I come in stillness. It's a traditional Virath medical greeting. The coordinator, a Thyran, 4-armed, looked like someone had stretched a frog over a very polite skeleton, actually made a sound I later learned was the equivalent of a sharp inhale of surprise. So, passable Virath, that was my ticket in. OS7 is enormous. I want you to understand that first. When humans build hospitals, we build up or we build wide, but we are constrained by gravity and budget, and the fact that we have a very particular idea of what a ceiling should be. OS7 was built by the Vithran Collective, and the Vithran Collective does not share any of those constraints. The station has 17 medical bays, each one calibrated to the atmospheric and gravitational requirements of a different coalition species. There are corridors that angle at 30 degrees and stay that way for 100 meters. There are wards where the lights pulse at frequencies humans can't perceive. There are rooms that smell like nothing, rooms that smell like burning copper, rooms that smell like something I can only describe as the color purple if purple were a smell. My quarters were human standard, small. I'd requested small, actually. After a long shift surrounded by beings whose biology made me feel like I was made of wet paper, coming back to a room the size of a shipping container felt like mercy. The work itself was strange. My official role was observer consultant, which meant I attended emergency responses, offered input when asked, and wrote detailed reports on protocol differences between human and coalition emergency medicine. In practice, it meant I ran alongside Virath and Thyron and Grelka medics through corridors that weren't built for my legs, trying to be useful, trying to learn, trying not to embarrass my entire species. I got pretty good at it. 11 months in, I'd earned something. Not full trust. I don't think full trust was ever on the table, but something. A kind of grudging respect. The kind of respect that comes from showing up, from not flinching, from doing the work consistently even when you're the only mammal in a room full of beings who process oxygen through Gill analogs and think the idea of a skeleton inside your body is unsettling. The Virath in particular were hard to read. They're the dominant species in the Vithrin collective, which means they run most of the station's medical operations. They look okay. This is always where humans struggle. They look like if you took a mantis shrimp and gave it 4 years of graduate education and strong opinions about sterile technique. They have these iridescent carapaces, colors shifting with their mood in ways I was still learning to decode. They have 6 limbs, 4 of which they use for fine manipulation, 2 of which function as legs. They're about 2/3 my height, but they move like water, like everything they do is completely frictionless. They're brilliant. I don't say that to be diplomatic. In emergency medicine, I've never worked with anyone better. Their response times, their diagnostic accuracy, their ability to process multiple patient inputs simultaneously. It's honestly humbling if you let yourself think about it too hard, which I tried not to. Sorrel 6 Ascending was my assigned counterpart. That's not quite the right word. Counterpart implies equality of role, and Sorrel was very much a senior nurse practitioner while I was very much an observer. But the assignment structure had me working primarily with Sorrel's team, which meant Sorrel and I spent about 60 hours a week in proximity, which, for a Virath, is a significant amount of time to spend near a human. Sorrel was older than me. I'm not sure by how much. Virath aging doesn't map well to human years, but there was a gravitas to them that felt earned. Their carapace was a deep, muted blue at rest. Virath blue means something like professional calm, the way a doctor's voice drops into neutral when they're delivering bad news. Sorrel had been a nurse practitioner on OS7 for what I gathered was the equivalent of 3 human decades. We'd worked out a communication system over those 11 months. Sorrel's spoken galactic standard was formal and precise. My Virath was passable but imperfect. So we developed this hybrid. Sorrel would speak standard. I'd respond in either standard or Virath depending on the complexity of what I needed to say, and we'd both pretend that the slight awkwardness of it was simply professional efficiency. I genuinely liked them. I want to say that clearly. I liked Sorrel before what happened, and what happened changed the shape of that feeling but didn't erase it. Now, the day this all went sideways. Chapter 3, the incident begins. It was a 7th rotation shift. OS7 doesn't run on a 24-hour cycle. It runs on a 31-hour cycle calibrated to the Vithrin home world, which means human circadian rhythms never quite sync up, which means I was permanently operating on about 6 hours of sleep per cycle, and a lot of reconstituted coffee that tasted like someone had described real coffee to a machine, and the machine had done its best. I came in for the shift with a low-grade headache and a shoulder that was already aching from the humidity in my quarters. The titanium plate reacts to pressure changes, something the coalition medics found fascinating and I found annoying. The shift started normal. We had a Thyron with a laceration that needed microsealing, a Grelka who had somehow managed to puncture their secondary breathing membrane. Don't ask, it's a whole thing. And a Keth traveler who was having an adverse reaction to the station's artificial gravity calibration. Standard stuff. The kind of shift where you go through the motions and your body handles it and your brain is mostly somewhere else. Then I started feeling wrong. It's hard to explain wrong, as a medical sensation when you're surrounded by doctors, because the reflex is to immediately rationalize it. I'd been on OS7 long enough that I'd experienced a dozen minor environmental reactions. The atmosphere mix on the station was breathable for humans but slightly lower in nitrogen than Earth standard, which could cause mild symptoms after extended exposure. I'd had headaches, dry eyes, occasional lightheadedness. I knew what my normal, slightly off on OS7 felt like. This was different. It started as a tingling in my hands, fine motor tingling, like I'd slept on them wrong but spreading slowly rather than fading. I noticed it during the Thyron laceration case. I was assisting with the microsealer calibration, and my hands felt faintly wrong, faintly distant, like they were wearing thin gloves I couldn't remove. I mentioned it to Sorrel. Sorrel paused their work, turned those compound eyes on me, and did the brief carapace color shift that I'd learned to read as assessment. Then, you received your scheduled endurance supplement this cycle. Write the supplement. This was the part of OS7 life that took the most explaining back home. Humans on extended coalition station postings had to take what was officially called a Coalition Environmental Adaptation Supplement, a monthly injection that adjusted a handful of metabolic markers to make long-term exposure to non-Earth standard environments more manageable. It dealt with things like the nitrogen differential, the specific radiation profile of coalition standard lighting, the slight pressure variations. Without it, humans doing extended tour on coalition installations started developing a specific cluster of symptoms, nothing fatal, but unpleasant and eventually debilitating. The supplement was administered by station medical staff, specifically, in my case, by Sorrel, who had handled my monthly injection since I arrived. I'd had my scheduled injection 2 days ago. I told Sorrel that, yes, I'd had the supplement 2 days ago. Sorrel's carapace went very, very still. That stillness, I hadn't seen it before, not exactly. I'd seen Sorrel in dozens of emergency situations, and the carapace always moved, color shifting in real time as Sorrel processed and responded. A completely still carapace was something different. Which arm, Sorrel said. It wasn't quite a question. I showed them. Left arm, interior of the elbow, same place every time. Sorrel looked at it for a long moment. Then they said something I'd never heard before in 11 months. In Virath, not Galactic Standard, Virath, specifically the language Sorrel knew I understood, the language that was harder to intercept on station monitoring. They said Velum Sorathi, Thuring Ka. The dosage I administered was incorrect. Please do not tell anyone yet. Chapter 4. Build tension. I want to take a second here to explain what that sentence meant, because the translation I just gave you is technically accurate but emotionally incomplete. Velum Sorathi, the medical greeting I'd used in my recruitment interview, Sorrel was using it back at me. I come in care, it said to patients. Sorrel had never said it to me before, not in 11 months, because I was staff, not a patient. Thuring Ka, stillness surgeon. It's a compound word. Thurin is stillness, peace, the way a waiting room feels. Ka is the urgency suffix, the word component that turns a calm thing into a pressing one. Stillness surgeon. Stay calm, but this is important. And then the dosage was incorrect. Don't tell anyone. My hands were tingling, and a Virath nurse practitioner with 30 years of experience was looking at me with a completely still carapace and asking me to keep quiet. I had approximately 4 seconds of pure, animal-human panic. And then something happened that I didn't expect. The panic didn't go away exactly, but it stepped back. It made room. Because I'd worked with Sorrel for 11 months, and in those 11 months I had never, not once, seen Sorrel make a mistake. And I had never once seen Sorrel put their own interests ahead of a patient's safety. Which meant that, please don't tell anyone, wasn't about protecting Sorrel. It was about something else. "Walk me through it," I said in Virath quietly. Sorrel moved us to a side corridor, not a private room, because pulling me into a private room would register on the station's movement tracking, and Sorrel was clearly thinking about monitoring, just an alcove off the main bay, the kind of space where you'd pause to consult a tablet or take a breath. What Sorrel told me in a fast, low, precise Virath that I had to work to keep up with was this. The Coalition Environmental Adaptation Supplement came in 3 formulations: Standard Human, Modified Human Extended, and Pediatric. The difference between Standard Human and Modified Human Extended was primarily in the concentration of 2 metabolic adjustment compounds, thranovic acid and lesinbind. Modified Extended was designed for humans doing postings of more than 18 months, because longer exposure required a stronger baseline adaptation. I'd been scheduled for my first modified extended dose this cycle. 11 months was up, and the program protocol was to transition human personnel to the extended formula at the 12-month threshold with a 1-month lead-in. Sorrel had administered the modified extended dose correctly. The problem was what had shown up in my file overnight. My medical records, Human Medical Records, Earthside, had finally been fully integrated into the Coalition system. There had been a delay because the data format conversion was apparently a nightmare, the kind of bureaucratic mess that happens when 2 species try to make their computer systems talk to each other. The integration had completed 2 days ago. And in my Earthside medical records was a notation that had not been in my intake physical. A documented sensitivity to lesinbind compound analogs. I'd had a reaction in my mid-20s, minor, treated easily, long resolved, to a now discontinued Earth pharmaceutical called lesinide. Lesinide was biochemically unrelated to lesinbind by any pre-accord pharmacological analysis. But the post-accord research that had emerged over the last 3 years, specifically a Virath pharmaceutical paper that had only been published 18 months ago and was not yet in general Coalition clinical circulation, showed a cross-species analog sensitivity between certain lesinide class compounds and lesinbind. In humans who had documented lesinide sensitivity, lesinbind at modified extended concentrations could trigger a cascade of symptoms that started with peripheral tingling and, if untreated, progressed to muscular weakness, proprioceptive disruption, and in approximately 4% of cases, a specific kind of cardiac arrhythmia that this was the word Sorrel used, and I remember it exactly, recoverable but not without intervention. 4%. That's not a large number. It's actually a pretty small number. Most of the time you'd never hit it. But 4% of a cardiac arrhythmia is not 0%. Sorrel had administered the dose before the record integration completed. Had administered it, gone home. Virath don't have homes exactly. They have what I describe as a stationary meditation period. And then been flagged the next morning when the integration ran its cross-check and threw up an alert. Sorrel had spent 18 hours trying to figure out what to do. Here's where it gets complicated. Here's where I need you to understand something about Coalition medical protocol that I hadn't fully grasped until Sorrel explained it to me in that alcove. A dosage error of this type, administering a compound to a patient with a newly identified sensitivity, triggered an automatic formal review process. Coalition Mandatory Incident Protocol, which meant Sorrel would have to file a report, which meant station administration would be notified, which meant the Coalition Medical Exchange Oversight Board would be notified, which meant the Human Liaison Office would be notified, which meant, in all likelihood, the program would want to review the incident involving the human participant, which meant me being reviewed, being assessed, possibly being flagged for early program termination because the Coalition Oversight Board was famously risk-averse when it came to human participants, because humans were the newest and least tested species in the exchange, because any adverse event involving a human was disproportionately likely to result in the program pulling that human off station. And here was the thing that I watched unfold on Sorrel's carapace as they told me this. The slow shift from blue professional comm to something I'd never seen on Sorrel before, a kind of muted gold at the edges, which I'd only ever seen on distressed patients, which I knew by then meant something close to shame. Sorrel didn't tell me about the dosage error right away, because Sorrel had spent 18 hours trying to figure out if there was a way to handle it without triggering the formal review. Not to protect themselves, to protect me. Because Sorrel knew what the formal review would mean for my posting, and Sorrel didn't want me to lose it. The tingling in my hands was getting worse. Chapter 5: The Human and the Machine. Let me talk for a minute about what being a human in a coalition medical facility actually does to you over time. It's subtle, the way it changes you. You come in thinking you're going to be an ambassador of some kind, representing humanity in the stars, all of that. You read the briefing materials and you feel like you're part of something historic, and you are, genuinely, but the day-to-day reality of being part of something historic is that you're mostly just the person who has to ask for directions in an unfamiliar language, while everyone around you is 3 times more efficient than you and processes sensory information on spectrums you can't perceive. You start to internalize a certain smallness. Not self-pity, it's not self-pity. It's more like recalibration. You figure out what you're actually good at in this environment, and you let go of the things you thought you were good at but aren't or can't demonstrate here. You find your usefulness. You get better at finding it faster. For me, it was the things that Vyrath medicine didn't have a framework for: intuition-based diagnosis, patient communication, the ability to sit with someone, any species, it turned out, and make them feel less afraid without any medical intervention at all. The Vyrath were extraordinary clinicians, but their bedside manner was calibrated to Vyrath patients, and Vyrath patients don't process emotional reassurance the way other species do. When a Thyran came in terrified, I was the one who'd go in first and just talk. When a Grelka patient was so worked up that their respiratory rate was spiking the monitors, I'd sit on the floor next to their treatment surface, because I was short enough that it was comfortable, and because eye-level contact across species was a thing I'd gotten better at, and just be calm at them until they came down. I'd become, accidentally, the station's unofficial cross-species emotional first responder. Sorrel had noticed, had mentioned it once in the dry, precise way Sorrel mentioned things. Your non-technical contributions have measurable patient outcome impact, which from Sorrel was basically a speech. What I'm saying is, I had built something there. 11 months of small, consistent, unglamorous work had built me a place inside OS7 that felt real, that felt earned. That felt like more than the human curiosity, novelty, that some of the other species still regarded me as. And Sorrel had spent 18 hours trying to protect that. I stood in that alcove and my hands were tingling and I felt something that's hard to describe. Gratitude, yes. Alarm, obviously. But also this strange, stabilizing awareness, this clarity. I wasn't angry. You might have expected anger. A medical professional made an error and then sat on it for 18 hours instead of telling me. That's objectively bad. That is, by any standard, not what you want happening with your health care. But I understood. I understood in a way that surprised me. Because I'd spent 11 months trying to figure out how Vyrath thought, how they moved through the world, what drove them, and I'd realized slowly that for Sorrel the concept of shame around a medical error wasn't just professional, it was almost existential. The Vyrath sense of self was built on a foundation of competence and care. An error didn't just affect your record, it affected who you were. And Sorrel had made the error while trying to do the right thing, trying to prepare me for an extended posting, using a protocol that was correct by every standard in place at the time of administration. And then the world had updated, the records had integrated, the alert had fired, and suddenly correct had become incorrect retroactively. That's not negligence. That's the gap between systems that haven't caught up to each other yet. I knew that gap. I'd lived in the gap between human and coalition systems for 11 months. It was my whole job. Okay, I said, in Virath, here's what we're going to do. Sorrel's carapace shifted, a new color I hadn't cataloged yet, something between question and relief. You're going to file the incident report, I said, but we're going to file it right, and we're going to file it together. Chapter 6 Climax. Together, Sorrel said, flat, not disbelieving, just processing. Together, I confirmed. Because the incident report is going to look very different depending on who's writing it and what context gets included. My hands were still tingling. I was aware of my heartbeat in a specific way that I didn't love, not irregular, not yet just present, the way your heartbeat becomes present when you're thinking about it. 4%, the rational part of my brain was saying, "You're probably fine." The irrational part of my brain was doing math on 4% that wasn't helpful. First, I said, I need you to tell me what the current symptom trajectory looks like if this is going where you think it might go. Sorrel ran through it. Clinical, precise, no softening. That was one of the things I respected about Sorrel. When there was information that needed to be delivered, they delivered it without decorating it. The tingling would likely peak in the next 2 to 4 hours. If it was going to progress, I'd see muscular involvement beginning in the forearms within that window. We could monitor. There was a counteragent, not a reverse, because you couldn't undeliver a dose, but a binding agent that would reduce the lesson-bind bioavailability and slow the cascade. Sorrel had already pulled it from the pharmacy, had been carrying it for 8 hours, waiting. Of course they had. Administer the binding agent, I said. The report. The report can happen while the binding agent is working. Administer it first. There was a brief pause. Then Sorrel did something I'd only seen them do twice in 11 months. They lowered what passed for their head. It was less a bow than a slow tilt. A Virath gesture I'd finally identified as something close to acknowledgement, and administered the injection. The binding agent went in, and within about 6 minutes the tingling in my hand started to recede. Not gone, it would take hours to clear fully, but softer, manageable. Then we sat down with a reporting terminal in one of the consultation alcoves, and I watched Sorrel begin to write the incident report, and I started to understand what 18 hours of thinking looked like in document form. The report Sorrel had drafted it was accurate technically. Everything in it was true. But it was structured in a way that foregrounded the error and Sorrel's delayed notification in a way that made both look worse than they were. It read like someone writing a report while deep in shame, hitting themselves with every sentence. The delay in notification was described as a procedural deviation. The error itself was characterized in terms that were technically correct, but stripped of all the contextual complexity. I read it and thought, if the oversight board sees this, they're going to see a nurse who made a mistake and then concealed it. And they're going to see a human patient. And they're going to do what they always do with human patients, which is assume we're fragile and pull us out of the environment for our own protection. Can I add context sections? I asked. Sorrel looked at me. Coalition incident reports allow supplementary testimony from all parties, right? The patient can add a statement. Yes, Sorrel said slowly, but the patient statement is advisory, the primary report. Let me worry about the patient statement, I said. You make the primary report accurate. I'll make the context clear. I spent the next 40 minutes writing the most careful, precise document I'd written in my life. I'm not a writer. I want to be clear about that. I'm a paramedic. My documentation skills are functional and nothing more. But 11 months of writing reports for a coalition audience had taught me something about how they read, the specific weight given to sequential logical framing, the way evidence was expected to be presented. the importance of what Virath academic writing called Thüring context, which roughly translated meant the stillness of understanding that surrounds an event. I wrote about the record integration delay. I sourced it. I had the timestamps. I'd been CC'd on the communications about the integration process back when it was still ongoing. I wrote about the Virath pharmacological paper, the one with the cross-analog sensitivity findings, and the fact that it hadn't reached general clinical circulation yet. I wrote about the fact that Searle had administered a dose that was correct by every standard in place at the time of administration, and that the retroactive nature of the sensitivity identification was a systemic issue, not an individual error. And then I wrote about what Searle had done in the 18 hours between the alert and the moment they told me. I wrote that Searle had pulled the binding agent from the pharmacy and had been carrying it for 8 hours, ready to administer at the moment they told me. I wrote that Searle had monitored my symptom progression remotely through my staff BioSigns throughout the night. I found out about this part halfway through the writing when Searle, quietly, showed me the monitoring log. 8 hours of passive BioSign monitoring, ready to escalate if anything had moved outside safe parameters. Searle hadn't delayed telling me because they were hiding. They delayed telling me because they were watching me, and they wanted to tell me with a solution already in hand. That's not a cover-up, that's a nurse. I wrote that clearly. Then I wrote about what the 18 hours had cost Searle. Not in justification of the delay. I acknowledged the delay was not compliant with protocol, and that the protocol existed for good reasons. But I wrote about what it meant that a Virath nurse practitioner with 30 years of spotless practice had spent 18 hours in what I could only describe as private suffering over an error that the systems around them had made possible. I wrote, "This incident reveals a gap, not a failure. The gap is between the pace of medical research and the pace of clinical distribution. The gap is between data systems that should communicate with each other and don't yet. The gap is between the formal requirements of incident reporting and the human reality. And I use human here in its broadest sense to mean any being capable of care, of a clinician who made an error and could not tell the patient immediately because they were not yet sure how to protect the patient from the consequences of that error. I am writing this statement not to excuse the delay in notification. I am writing it to ensure that the review board understands what the delay was and what it was not. It was not an attempt to hide. It was an attempt to fix. I looked at it for a long time when I was done. Then I submitted it as my patient testimony. Searle read it. I watched the carapace go through a sequence of colors I didn't have complete vocabulary for. Some of it was the muted gold of distress. Some of it was a clear, bright violet that I'd seen on patients who had received good news they hadn't expected. Searle said, "This is accurate." "I know," I said. "That's why I wrote it." The formal review took 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which I stayed on OS7 and kept working, because my status was technically unchanged until the review concluded. 3 weeks during which I had to file daily BioSign reports and weekly symptom assessments as the lesson bind fully cleared my system. 3 weeks during which the Oversight Board reviewed documents and probably argued, and did whatever oversight boards do. I kept working. That was important to me, keeping working. Not as a gesture or a statement, just I had a job to do. There were patients. The Grelka traveler I mentioned, the one with the breathing membrane issue, had a longer than expected recovery and needed consistent monitoring. A Thyron family came in with what turned out to be a systemic environmental reaction to the station's air recycling system. 2 new human exchange participants arrived, fresh off the transit shuttle, wide-eyed and altitude-sick from the pressure differential, and I went to meet them at the arrival bay because nobody had met me when I arrived, and I'd found that disorienting. I taught the new arrivals how to say Velem Sorathi. Both of them practiced it for 10 minutes in the corridor. One of them had it almost exactly right on the first try, and I felt absurdly proud. Sorrel worked. We didn't talk much about the review, mostly because there wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said in the documents, but something had shifted between us. I don't know how to describe it precisely. When you've had a hard conversation with someone and come out the other side, there's a weight that lifts, and sometimes what's under the weight is something better than what you had before. About a week in, Sorrel came to find me between rounds and handed me a small data chip. The Vireth pharmacological paper, they said, the one on cross-analog sensitivities. I requested it be added to the Coalition Clinical Circulation Priority List. It has been approved. Distribution will begin this cycle. They didn't say anything else. They went back to work. I held that chip for a minute. It was small and smooth and weighed nothing. It would mean that every Coalition medical facility would have that paper in their clinical database within 30 days. It would mean that the gap that had contributed to my dosage issue would be, in part, closed. Not all the way, there were always more gaps, but this one, at least, was getting smaller. The review concluded on a Tuesday. OS 7 doesn't have Tuesdays technically, but I was still running on a rough Earth Week internal clock, and that's how I remember it. The board's determination was 3 pages long, and I'm going to give you the summary because reading 3 pages of Coalition administrative language is not something I wish on anyone. The summary was, the incident was classified as a systemic contextual adverse event rather than an individual error. Sorrel received a notation in their file. This was unavoidable under Coalition protocol, and Sorrel accepted it without complaint. But the notation was classified as remedial rather than disciplinary, and it specifically referenced the mitigating context of the record integration failure and the data distribution gap. Sorrel was cleared for continued practice. The board also issued 2 systemic recommendations. One was the fast tracking of the cross-analog sensitivity paper into clinical circulation, which Sorrel had already initiated. The other was a formal recommendation that all Coalition stations with human exchange participants be required to complete a manual review of human medical records upon integration, rather than relying solely on automated cross-checking. This second recommendation, apparently, sparked quite a debate at the board level. There were members who felt it set a precedent of giving human records special manual review attention that wasn't applied to other species. The counterargument, which made it into the written determination, which I still have a copy of, was that human records represented the most data formatting compatible files in the Coalition system, not because of anything inherent to humans, but because the Accord integration of human data had been the most recent and was therefore the least refined. We're not special, we're just new, and new things need extra attention until they're not new anymore. As for me, I was cleared for continuation of my exchange posting. My posting was extended by 4 months to account for the review period. I found out on that Tuesday by way of a message from the station administrator, a Grelka named Verith9, who communicated entirely through formal written correspondence even when you were standing 3 feet away from them, which was a cultural thing I'd eventually stopped finding strange, delivered to my quarters. The message said, "Your participation in the review process has been noted as a contributing factor in the systemic recommendations. The board extends appreciation for your written testimony." I sat in my small room and stared at the wall for a while. Then I went to work. What changed after? Nothing dramatic. No parades, no grand gestures. This isn't a story where something dramatic happens as a result. It's more like the shape of things shifted slightly. The way light changes when a cloud moves, not a new sun. Sorrel and I kept working together. We got better at it. I started catching things in patient presentations that I wouldn't have caught 6 months earlier, because working alongside someone with Sorrel's diagnostic precision for long enough starts to change how you look at problems. And Sorrel started not softening exactly, because Sorrel was never hard exactly, but incorporating. There's a Virath word for it, threnok, which translates literally to the practice of adding threads. Building something larger by adding to it. Sorrel started asking me more questions, not about human medicine specifically, but about how I read people, how I assessed fear in a patient who wasn't showing vital sign distress, how I decided when to stay silent versus when to speak, how I calibrated the emotional register of a room. I started asking Sorrel more questions too, about how Virath diagnostic intuition was trained, about what Sorrel saw in a carapace color shift that I was still learning to read, about the pharmacological paper, about what else was in that research pipeline that hadn't reached clinical circulation yet. We were, both of us, trying to close gaps. The two new human exchange participants became my unofficial wards. Not officially, the program didn't have a mentorship structure, but practically, I answered their questions. I walked them through the things it had taken me months to figure out. How to move in corridors built for different bodies, how to read carapace colors, how to be useful in an environment that hadn't been built for you. One of them asked me, about 2 months after they arrived, what had been the hardest part of my posting. I thought about it. Figuring out that being useful here isn't about being impressive, I said. It's about being consistent, showing up, not flinching. The things that feel small are the things that actually matter. They wrote it down. I didn't tell them to, they just did. I left OS 6 months after the incident. End of posting, natural conclusion, handshake with Virath 9, who did not actually shake hands but extended one of their smaller limbs in a gesture that I'd learned was the equivalent, and a long walk through corridors that had stopped feeling alien a while ago. Sorrel met me at the departure bay. This was unusual. Virath don't really do goodbyes, at least not in any way humans would recognize. Their sense of relationship continuity is different, more continuous, less punctuated. The idea of marking an ending is kind of foreign to them. You don't say goodbye to someone whose thread is woven into the pattern. The thread doesn't go away when the person leaves. But Sorrel was there. They said, Velum Sorathi. I come in care. The greeting, the thing you say at the beginning. I understood, no goodbyes, just another beginning. I said it back, Velum Sorathi, Velum Thurin. I come in care, I come in stillness. The same words I'd said in my recruitment interview 3 years before. The words that had gotten me on the station in the first place. Sorrel's carapace did the thing with the violet again. The unexpected good news color. And then they went back to work because there were patients and the shift didn't stop for departures. I walked through the departure gate with my bag over one shoulder and the slight ache in my titanium-plated left shoulder that was always there, and I thought, that's it. That's the whole thing. A nurse made an error. A nurse spent 18 hours trying to fix it before telling me. I spent 40 minutes writing the most important document of my medical career to explain why that wasn't the worst thing and why the systems around them had made it possible. A paper got fast-tracked. A manual review protocol got recommended. 2 new exchange participants learned how to say a greeting in a language not their own. No heroics, no dramatic confrontation, no grand moment where humanity proved itself to the galaxy. Just people, different kinds of people, trying to close the gap between what they knew and what they didn't know, trying to do the work, trying to be careful with each other. I used to read HFY posts and feel that Rushov were something special, that big triumphant feeling. And we are, maybe. Humans are something. I've seen enough of the galaxy now to have an opinion on that. But what we are isn't what I thought it was when I was a kid, reading stories on a tablet during a cargo shift. What we are is stubborn about the gaps. We don't like them. When we find a place where the systems don't talk to each other, where the knowledge hasn't traveled to where it needs to be, where the person in front of us doesn't feel seen, we want to close it. We will go out of our way to close it. We will sit in an alcove with a tingling hand and write a 40-minute document to close it. That's the thing, maybe. That's the human thing. Not that we're stronger or braver or harder to kill than everything else, though maybe some of that's true too. But that we will absolutely, stubbornly, infuriatingly try to close the gap, even when it's not our gap to close, even when we have a tingling hand and a 4% arrhythmia risk, and probably no business writing coalition administrative documents. We just do it anyway. Chapter 10 Coda. I've been home for 7 months now. I'm back in emergency medicine, Earthside, which feels both smaller and larger than I expected. Smaller because the corridors are human-sized, and the ceilings are where ceilings should be, and everything smells the way things should smell. Larger because I keep finding the gaps everywhere, and now I can't not see them. Protocol gaps, communication gaps, the places where the knowledge is there but hasn't traveled to where it needs to be. The places where someone made an error and is writing the report in the language of shame instead of the language of context. I write a lot of context now. My supervisor asked me last month why I was taking so much extra time on incident documentation. I told her about the coalition incident report format, about Thuring context, about the stillness of understanding that surrounds an event. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "I have no idea what that means, but the reports have been better." Good enough. I got a message from Sorrel 2 months ago, sent through the Coalition Human Exchange Communications Relay, which takes about 3 days to route each way. Short message: Sorrel communicates in writing the way Sorrel communicates in speech, precisely and without excess. It said, the cross-analog sensitivity protocol is now standard in all VThrin collective medical facilities. 8 adverse events were prevented in the first 4 months of implementation. You are listed as a contributing reference in the protocol documentation. 8 humans, or 8 of whoever, 8 beings who didn't have to sit in an alcove with tingling hands wondering about 4%. I read the message about 5 times. Then I wrote back. Took me a while to get the vireth right, it gets rusty without daily practice, but I checked it against my notes and I think it was close. 8 threads added to the pattern, I wrote. Thuring Ka, this is the work. 8 threads. That's the whole story, that's all of it. 8 threads added to the pattern, because a nurse was careful enough to carry a binding agent for 8 hours just in case, and a human was stubborn enough to write 40 minutes of context, and 2 systems finally, slowly, learned to talk to each other. Velum Sarathi. I come and care. That's enough, that's more than enough.